The night did not feel dangerous. It was quiet, warm, ordinary in the way most nights are when nothing bad is supposed to happen. Chelsea was at home, doing what she always did at the end of the day, putting her young son to sleep. The house was dim, peaceful, the kind of calm you don't notice until it's gone. Then her phone rang. It was her father. His voice didn't sound frantic. It didn't sound broken. "There's been an accident," he said. "Your mom's okay. The ambulance is on the way."
And I remember my phone going off, and it was my father. "There's been an accident, your mom's okay, the ambulance is on the way." And I was like, whoa. And I just ran out the door. I lived right next door. I had no idea what happened.
For a second, Chelsea froze. An accident? Okay, how okay is okay? She didn't ask questions. She didn't wait. She ran out the door barefoot, crossing the short distance to her parents' house next door. Her heart was already racing, faster than her thoughts could keep up with. As soon as she walked inside, she knew this wasn't okay. Melissa Rocuba was lying on the bed. Her body was still. Her hair was matted with blood. It wasn't a small amount. It wasn't something you could look away from. Blood covered the floor, the side of the bed. The room itself felt soaked in it. Chelsea didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She grabbed a towel from the floor, pressed it against her mother's head, and begged, "Please, Mom, just squeeze my hand." Nothing. No movement. No response. No reassurance that her mother was still there, somewhere in the house. Her father was on the phone. Chelsea could hear his voice, but she couldn't see him. He wasn't beside the bed. He wasn't helping her hold the towel. He was elsewhere. Time stopped behaving normally. Seconds stretched. Sounds blurred. Her own voice felt distant as she kept pleading with her mother to stay. At some point, her father said something that would echo later. He mentioned a gun. He said he was putting it away. He said it had gone off. Chelsea barely processed the words. All she could see was her mother bleeding out in front of her. All she could feel was a wave of truth she didn't yet understand, but somehow sensed this was not just an accident, not in the way people mean when they say that word. Sirens grew louder outside. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows. But inside that bedroom, before the paramedics arrived, before the police, before explanations and timelines and statements, a daughter was holding her mother's head, asking her not to die, and getting no answer. By the time police arrived, the story was already forming. It was simple, clean, comforting in the way explanations often are when no one wants to imagine something darker. Melissa's husband told officers a gun had gone off by mistake, an accidental discharge. He said he was handling the firearm when it fired unexpectedly. He didn't say there was an argument. He didn't say there was fear. He didn't say there was anger in the room. Just a mistake. Just a moment that couldn't be taken back. The gun, he explained, had been in the house for protection. Like many families, they believed it made them safer. That night, according to him, he was moving it, adjusting it, putting it away. Then it fired. One sound, one instant, one irreversible outcome. Police listened. They looked at the scene. A married couple, a quiet home, no signs of forced entry, no immediate evidence of a struggle that screamed violence, and most importantly, a husband who was cooperative, calm, controlled. He answered questions. He didn't run. He didn't resist. He didn't look like the kind of man people imagine when they hear the word killer. In moments like these, investigators rely on patterns, and the pattern fit. Accidental shootings happen. Tragic mistakes happen. Families are destroyed by seconds of carelessness. It was easier to believe that than anything else. So the word accident entered the record. It softened the scene, gave the night a narrative that felt survivable. No one pushed hard. Not yet. Melissa was rushed to the hospital, still alive, still fighting. Though no one could say how long she'd been unconscious, the focus shifted to saving her life, not questioning how it came to be at risk. Her husband was not arrested. He wasn't handcuffed. He wasn't separated like a suspect. He was treated like a man who had just lost control of fate. not a man who might have taken control of someone else's life. And this is where belief becomes dangerous, because once a story is accepted early, it shapes everything that follows. Evidence is filtered through it. Questions bend around it. Doubts are delayed. At that moment, the system chose a path of least resistance. I understand why. When a family is bleeding in front of you, when a woman is fighting for her life, the human instinct is to stabilize first, investigate later. But sometimes later never fully comes. And sometimes the truth doesn't shout. It waits, quietly. State troopers arrived after the paramedics had already taken Melissa away. The house was no longer chaotic. No screams, no rushing footsteps, just silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's holding on to something it hasn't released yet. The troopers did what they are trained to do. They secured the scene. They walked room to room. They looked for anything obvious, signs of forced entry, signs of a struggle, signs that didn't fit the story they'd already been told. And then came the reenactment. Melissa's husband picked up a toy gun, not the real weapon, a plastic stand-in. He demonstrated how the firearm had gone off, where he was standing, how he was holding it, where Melissa was positioned on the bed. The explanation sounded practiced, but not rehearsed, calm, but not cold, the kind of tone that sits right in the middle, where people don't immediately feel alarmed. Troopers watched. They nodded. They took notes. Nothing about the walkthrough forced an immediate contradiction. No dramatic moment where someone said, "That's impossible." No sudden shift in body language that screamed deception. So they didn't arrest him. There were no handcuffs, no ride to jail, no charge. Instead, he remained in the home, a husband whose wife was critically injured, a man framed by the moment as tragic, not threatening. From the outside, the system appeared calm, professional, controlled, but calm can sometimes hide hesitation. Certain things were not done right away. Certain questions were not pushed. Certain possibilities were left unopened. The gun was secured. The scene was documented, but the urgency felt muted. And here is where doubt does announce itself loudly. It creeps in quietly, because accidental shootings usually leave chaos behind. Panic, disorder, movement. Yet parts of the room felt strangely still, as if time had been paused before anyone rushed to help, because reenactments usually come after deep questioning, not before it, because when someone demonstrates an accident so quickly, so cleanly, it can feel less like confusion and more like certainty. I'm not saying the troopers were careless. I think they believed what they were seeing, and belief shapes perception. When officers believe they're looking at an accident, they search for confirmation, not contradiction. It's human. It's procedural. It happens more often than people realize. But something about that night lingered. Not enough to make an arrest. Not enough to raise alarms. Just enough to sit quietly in the background, like a room that feels colder than it should. Melissa Rocuba arrived at the hospital under the hum of bright, sterile lights. The helicopter blades had barely stopped spinning when doctors rushed her through the doors. Her body had already endured too much. A bullet wound to the head left her fragile, barely holding on to life. Machines beeped steadily, a rhythm that was supposed to comfort, but only reminded her family of the fragile thread keeping her here. Her daughters, Chelsea and Sabrina, and her sister Joanne, waited outside the intensive care unit. Each tick of the clock felt unbearably slow. Each faint beat made the reality sink deeper. Their mother, their sister, the center of their family, might not survive a night. Chelsea remembers the panic that gripped her. She had no control. Only prayers that were whispered over and over in corners of rooms she couldn't leave. Her thoughts were fractured. Questions flying. Will she wake up? Will she know I'm here? Will she see my son grow? Hours stretched into days. Doctors tried everything they could. They worked with precision and care. But Melissa's body had already suffered too much trauma. Her family sat at her bedside, speaking softly, telling her they loved her, telling her she was strong, telling her she wasn't alone. Yet, despite their presence, the machines couldn't replace the life that had been interrupted. The family faced the hardest decision they could imagine, whether to let her go, After agonizing discussions with doctors, weighing hope against suffering, they made the painful choice to remove life support. It was in the early hours of August 10th, 2013 at 1:45 a.m. when Melissa passed away. A daughter remembers the stillness of the room, the finality in a moment that felt endless and yet instantaneous. Her death left an emptiness that wasn't just physical. It was the absence of warmth at the center of family dinners, the silence in her favorite chair, the missing laughter that once echoed through the house. The tragedy of Melissa's passing was compounded by its suddenness, by the lack of understanding about how it happened, and by the unresolved questions that lingered in every conversation her family tried to have. They weren't just mourning a mother or a wife. They were mourning the trust they had in safety, in family, in the ordinary calm of an evening that had turned into unimaginable loss. Even now, her daughters speak of her not in whispers, but with reverence. Her love, her humor, her strength, the life she gave them, and the memory that continues to define their grief. Melissa Rocuba's fight ended in the ICU that night, but her story and the questions around it were only beginning to unfold. Melissa's death hit her family like a storm with no warning. Chelsea, Sabrina, and Joan couldn't process it. Not fully. Not yet. They kept replaying that night over and over in their minds. The blood, the ambulance, the sterile hospital rooms, the sense of panic that had gripped them before the first explanation even made sense. But one thought refused to leave them. Why wasn't he arrested? Bruno Rocuba, Melissa's husband, remained free. He had held the gun that ended his wife's life. He had been at the center of the chaos. And yet, he walked away without handcuffs, without a single night in jail. Joanne's father, a retired police officer in another county, looked at the situation and shook his head in disbelief. If this happened in Bucks County, he told her, he would have been in cuffs immediately. The comparison cut deeper than they expected. In their minds, the rules of law weren't being applied equally. Not here, not to them, not to Melissa. They began noticing other things, small inconsistencies, moments that didn't fit the story they'd been told. Chelsea remembered her father's calmness at the hospital, the strange requests he made, even as her mother lay in the ICU. The family realized they were watching someone whose behavior didn't align with the narrative of accidental tragedy. Early doubts crept in. Sabrina noticed it first. How quickly Bruno seemed to want life to go back to normal. How he asked him to handle the aftermath in ways that felt odd. Chelsea remembered being asked to bring him her mother's phone, and later, the mattress, the blood-stained mattress. Questions began stacking in their minds, one on top of the other. Was it really an accident? Was there more we didn't know? But no one outside the family seemed ready to ask these questions yet. Police reports suggested the scene supported the accident narrative. Investigators had followed protocol. Statements were taken. Evidence was collected. And still, there was this nagging sense that something had been overlooked. The daughters, raised to trust authority and family, found themselves at a crossroads of grief and skepticism. They didn't want to believe that the person who was supposed to protect their mother might also have been responsible for her death. Yet the feeling persisted. Something about the calmness, the timing, the way explanations had been given. Something about it didn't sit right. And in that uneasy space between grief and doubt, the seeds of a deeper investigation were quietly planted. Because when a tragedy feels too neat, too clean, human instincts start asking questions that the law may not yet have considered. Chelsea and her sisters had begun to ask theirs. From the outside, the Rocuba family seemed like a storybook family. Melissa and Bruno had met in the summer of 1988. She was just 19, a young woman full of ambition and dedication, working as a police officer. He was 22, a Navy enlistee, disciplined and steady. To anyone who looked in, they were perfectly matched. Friends described them as inseparable, a couple who laughed together, who celebrated life's milestones as a unit. Chelsea remembers family trips that felt magical. The way her father taught her to fish, the way Melissa would braid their hair in mornings, every birthday, every holiday, carried a sense of warmth that now seemed painfully fragile in memory. Her father was a kind of man children trusted implicitly. He could make mundane activities, go in a grocery store, wash in the car, even quiet evenings at home, feel like moments to remember. Chelsea recalls wanting to emulate him, wanting to be near him, feeling safe when he was around. Melissa, for her part, was devoted to her daughters and her family. She loved being a wife, loved being a mother. Her laughter was a constant in the household, a presence that made the house feel alive. Neighbors often said the house radiated happiness. Even people who didn't know them closely assumed that things were fine, and that perception matters. It shapes how we interpret later events, how easy the truth can hide behind appearances. But as in so many families, the story that outsiders saw was only one layer. The smiles, the shared vacations, the Christmas dinners. They were real, but they were not the whole picture. There were cracks beneath the surface, quiet disagreements, tensions that Melissa worked to hide from the girls, from the community, from anyone who might judge. The illusion of perfection made what came next all the more jarring, because when a veneer of happiness begins to fracture, it doesn't just reveal arguments or sadness. It exposes control, manipulation, and sometimes danger. The Rocubas were loved genuinely, but love and devotion cannot always shield someone from harm. And that contrast between the image of a perfect family and the hidden truths of Melissa's life is what would come to define her story. As we begin to see the tension that had been building behind closed doors, it becomes clear that what looks safe and loving from the outside was, in reality, far more complicated and far more threatening than anyone could have imagined. The perfect family, it turns out, was just the story people wanted to believe. As the image of the Rocuba family began to crumble, the truth about Melissa's life behind closed doors slowly emerged. Chelsea and Sabrina remember moments that, at the time, didn't make sense. Moments that now, in retrospect, were warning signs. Their mother had endured incidents of physical aggression. One night, when Melissa had refused to be intimate with her husband, he had pulled a gun on her. It was a detail she shared quietly, cautiously, only with her daughters. She didn't want to frighten them, but she needed them to understand that even the person who loved you could also be capable of violence. Joanne, Melissa's sister, noticed the signs too. Melissa had confided in her that she felt trapped, controlled in ways that went beyond arguments. She wasn't allowed the freedom to make choices about her own life without fear of retaliation. Small freedoms, like where she could go or who she could see, were constantly monitored and questioned, and the gun incidents weren't isolated. They were part of a pattern, a tool for intimidation, a reminder of the power her husband wielded in private. It's important to understand that domestic violence rarely presents itself like a public scene of chaos. Often, it hides behind a smile, behind family dinners, behind holidays and vacations. The abuse is subtle, psychological, sometimes invisible to the outside world. It's in the constant questioning, the controlling behaviors, the way a spouse can make another feel unsafe even in their own home. Melissa's life was defined by this quiet fear, and yet she remained devoted to her daughters. She shielded them from the worst of it. She did not speak ill of her husband publicly, even as a tension grew inside the walls of their home. This is what makes domestic violence so insidious. It's not just a physical threat, it's emotional, psychological. It erodes trust, creates a cycle of fear, and leaves the victim isolated. And in Melissa's case, it meant that those closest to her, her children, were left with the confusing task of loving someone who had the capacity for violence, while grieving the pain inflicted. By the time of the shooting, the history of abuse had set the stage. The pattern of control, of intimidation, of fear was undeniable. What outsiders initially perceived as a tragic accident now had deeper context. Melissa's struggle was not just with a tragic event on one night. It was with years of manipulation, fear, and control that would ultimately shape the fatal circumstances of that evening. And in understanding this, we begin to see the true weight of what happened. Not just a loss of life, but the collapse of life lived under quiet terror. In the hours and days after Melissa's shooting, her family began noticing behaviors that didn't feel normal, behaviors that didn't belong to someone in mourning. Bruno Rocuba's request seemed almost clinical, detached, and chilling. He asked Chelsea to retrieve her mother's cell phone, a simple device, but inside it were messages that could reveal tensions, arguments, anything that might complicate the story he had told the police. Chelsea later realized he wanted certain pieces of information erased hidden from view, removed from any scrutiny. Then came the mattress, the bed where Melissa had sat, where the fatal shot had been fired. Bruno asked the daughters to remove it. Chelsea and Sabrina took it into the back of a truck and burned it in the woods. The blood-stained mattress, the memory it carried, the evidence of trauma, it was gone in moments. Not long after, they were told to gather Melissa's clothes, dresses she had loved, shoes she had worn, personal items filled with memory. All of it was sent away to a thrift store. And then there was Zeus, the family dog, the companion Melissa had loved, gone. Each act was small on its own, almost explainable to outsiders as grief or practicality, but together they painted a troubling picture. It wasn't just about hiding evidence. It was about erasing the presence of Melissa from home, from a memory, from the daily rhythm of their lives. Her absence was manipulated, controlled, and sanitized. The acts were psychological as much as physical, sending the message: she is gone. Her life can be rewritten. Her memory can be managed. Chelsea recalls the emotional dissonance. She was grieving. She was trying to process the trauma of seeing her mother shot, and yet she was being asked to participate in the systematic removal of every trace of her mother. The cognitive conflict was overwhelming. Love for her father mixed with fear and confusion. Grief entangled with suspicion. The psychological weight of these actions is profound. They signal a mindset attempting to control perception, to shape narrative, and to eliminate accountability. Behavioral evidence like this can often tell a story louder than any forensic report. Actions speak in the quiet spaces between words, in the moments when the law may not yet be looking. At this point, Melissa's daughters began to realize that the danger had not ended with the shooting. It continued in the manipulation, the erasures, the decisions about what could remain and what must disappear. And it was in these small, calculated behaviors that a deeper truth began to emerge, one that would later guide investigators and reshape the understanding of what really happened that night. For Chelsea and her sisters, grief was supposed to be the heaviest burden, losing their mother, watching her slip away, holding on to fragments of memory. They expected mourning to be slow, painful, and private. What they did not expect was the intrusion of someone else, so soon, so brazenly. Tonia Wachowski, the woman who would later become a focal point of suspicion, appeared in their lives almost immediately after Melissa's death. Chelsea recalls looking out the window and seeing her in her mother's kitchen, cooking Christmas dinner, the smell of cinnamon, the sight of a smiling woman using the tools and spaces that had once belonged to Melissa. It was surreal. It was more than shocking. It was a violation. The timing struck the family as impossible. How could someone step into the home so quickly after a tragedy and act as if nothing had happened? The symbolism was devastating. Melissa's chair, even the small details, Tonia's hairstyle like Melissa's, the subtle mimicry of habits Chelsea had thought only her mother could claim, felt like an intentional replacement. Chelsea admits it created a deep moral and emotional dissonance. The very fabric of her memory, of what her mother represented, seemed to be erased by someone who had no right to be there. She remembers the anger, the disbelief, the helplessness that came of watching Tonia occupy spaces that were filled with love, with history, with Melissa. Jack Wachowski, Tonia's husband, noticed it too. In the days following the shooting, he began seeing signs of a connection between Tonia and Bruno, a subtle closeness, whispered conversations, moments that didn't belong to friendship. The juxtaposition, life and laughter stepping into the vacuum of tragedy, felt like a betrayal to anyone watching closely. Chelsea and Sabrina tried to reconcile their father's actions with the sudden appearance of Tonia. They wanted to believe he was simply grieving, that humans seek comfort after loss. But something about the timing, the ease, the lack of hesitation, didn't sit right. It suggested planning, intention, and a disregard for the sanctity of Melissa's memory. This period was when doubt deepened into suspicion. The family realized that Melissa's death was not merely a tragic accident. It opened the door to more collapse. The very person who should have been mourning alongside them was already navigating a new relationship, potentially connected to the night of the shooting. And in that realization, Chelsea felt the first stirrings of something she would carry for years. The awareness that the life her mother had built and the love she had poured into her children could not simply be replaced or erased. This was no longer just grief. It was betrayal layered on top of tragedy. It marked a turning point in how Melissa's family understood the events of that night. Time as a way of revealing cracks in even the most carefully constructed stories. For years, Bruno Rocuba had maintained a single narrative. It was an accident, a tragic misfire, a moment of horror that no one could predicted. And for a long time, investigators, neighbors, and even his own daughters had held on to that story, struggling to reconcile the loving father they knew with the man accused of such a fatal mistake. But as Chelsea began to confront her father, the cracks appeared. She recalls one conversation, quiet, almost casual, that would change everything. Bruno said, "I didn't mean to kill her. I just tried to scare her." The words landed like stones in Chelsea's chest. Scare her? The phrase felt impossible to reconcile with the mother she had watched bleeding on her bedroom floor, the woman whose last moments had been stolen from her children. And in that statement, he also revealed another truth. There had been an argument, a real argument, not the imagined, peaceful night he had claimed. Chelsea's mind raced. The father she loved, the man she had once protected in her thoughts, was now admitting, in his own words, to threatening Melissa. And yet, as quickly as the revelation came, he shifted the conversation, diverted her attention, changed the subject. He tried to regain control, the same way he had controlled her mother's life, the household, the narrative. He even threatened Chelsea herself. "Go ahead and tell anyone," he said. "I'll ruin your credibility. Nobody will believe you." The weight of those words was heavy. A daughter, already traumatized by the loss of her mother, now faced the emotional power of a man willing to manipulate the truth, to bend perception, to protect himself at all costs. This is where the story begins to drift. The accident narrative can no longer hold. The admission of argument, the confession of intent to scare, the implicit threats of silence. Each layer revealed a man far more involved in the circumstances of his wife's death than he had ever admitted. For Chelsea, this was a turning point. She realized that her silence could no longer serve her father's story. She began documenting, reporting, and piecing together the inconsistencies that had been ignored, overlooked, or dismissed by those who had seen only what he allowed them to see. And in this moment, viewers started to understand what I began to understand as well. The truth of Melissa's death was far more complex, far darker, and far more deliberate than anyone had first imagined. The drift to confession shattered the illusion and set the stage for justice to finally catch up. Even as Chelsea tried to step forward with what she knew, the system that should have protected her mother and held her father accountable seemed deaf, distant, and unprepared. Her words, her memories, her witness account, they were met not with urgency, but with skepticism. Investigators suggested that Chelsea might be motivated by money, that her concern, her testimony, could be influenced by inheritance or personal gain. Imagine the weight of that accusation on a grieving daughter. She had just lost her mother in the most violent way imaginable, and now her sincerity was questioned, her voice dismissed. The very institution tasked with investigating the death treated her as unreliable, as if grief itself were a liability. Police files sat open but dormant. The initial 911 call had 3 conflicting accounts of what happened, but no one pushed further. Evidence was collected. Photographs were taken, but there was no urgency. Bruno Rocuba walked free. No charges, no custody questions, no accountability. The family watched in disbelief. In other counties, similar cases would have resulted in immediate arrest. In Bucks County, where her grandfather had served as a police officer, Chelsea recalls being told, "Your dad would have been in cuffs instantly." And yet here, in Lackawanna, the case went cold. It was more than just procedural oversight. It was a failure of judgment, of resources, of moral clarity. A daughter knew what had happened. Evidence existed. Inconsistencies abounded. And still, the machinery of justice stalled. This institutional failure left a scar that extended far beyond legal ramifications. It sent a silent message to Melissa's family. Your mother's life, your grief, your memories, they can be overlooked. The people responsible for enforcing the law, for seeking truth, had stepped aside, and in that vacuum, the narrative of the shooting remained under control. are the very man accused of causing it. It's hard not to feel anger on behalf of the family, not just at Bruno, but at the system itself. The trust we place in law enforcement, in the justice system, is meant to be absolute in moments of tragedy. When that trust is broken, when reports are dismissed, when a grieving daughter is questioned rather than believed, it compounds the trauma. In my opinion, I think this is one of the most heartbreaking parts of Melissa's story, because even when the truth is within reach, even when someone is brave enough to speak up, the system can fail. It reminds us that justice is never just about evidence. It's about the people who choose to act, and too often, those choices are flawed. In Melissa's case, the cold files, the ignored warnings of skepticism, these institutional failures bought time for deception. They allowed a false narrative to survive. And for nearly 9 years, the real story of that night remained hidden. Years had passed. Melissa Rocuba's death had become a quiet tragedy on a dusty shelf, a case that lingered in the shadows of unexamined evidence. For her family, the wound never healed, but the world moved on. And then, in 2020, a fresh pair of eyes arrived. Corporal Greg Allen, assigned to review open cases for Pennsylvania State Police, stumbled across Melissa's file. At first glance, it seemed like countless others. Reports, photographs, witness statements, and the initial conclusion that the shooting was an accident. But something about the 911 call, the inconsistencies in statements, and the family's accounts drew him in. He listened carefully, repeatedly, to that recording from the night of August 9th, 2013. 3 voices, overlapping panic confusion, and buried in the chaos were details that had never been fully explored. The daughter's fears, the father's conflicting accounts, the faint sound and argument in the background. All of it hinted at a story that didn't match the official narrative. Greg Allen approached the case differently. No assumptions, no rush to judgment, just methodical investigation. He treated the family's observations as evidence, not hearsay. The original detectives had struggled with technology and resources, unable to enhance audio or fully review surveillance recordings. But with modern tools and renewed focus, Allen could begin to hear what had been missed. The hope for Melissa's family returned slowly, almost tentatively. This was the first time in nearly 7 years that someone outside their household was truly listening. Someone was willing to question the accident story, to follow the threads that the initial investigation had overlooked. For Chelsea, the feeling was mixed, relief blended with fear. Could this finally lead to justice, or would it uncover a truth too painful to confront? She knew her father's version of events had already shifted multiple times, and now, finally, there was someone looking at the evidence without blind trust. The case reopening was not a guarantee of justice, but it was a spark, a signal that the system could still act, that the voice of a daughter might finally be heard, that Melissa's story could be told with clarity and truth. In my opinion, in true crime, sometimes a passage of time is a weapon and a blessing. Time allows trauma to settle, but it also allows fresh perspective. Melissa's death had been mishandled, yes, but the reopening of the case was the first real step toward accountability, toward untangling deception, and toward honoring her memory. This was the moment when hope returned, fragile but undeniable, a chance for the truth to finally be seen, for narrative to shift, and for justice to edge closer. When the case reopened, investigators turned to the most objective language available: science. Forensic evidence doesn't lie, and it doesn't bend to stories or emotions. It simply speaks. And in Melissa Rocuba's case, the evidence told a story far different from the accident narrative that had dominated for years. First, the gun itself. Bruno Rocuba had claimed the firearm discharged accidentally while checking the chamber, but forensic experts quickly noted something critical. The mechanics of the weapon made that scenario highly unlikely. Semi-automatic pistols are designed with multiple safeties, both a trigger safety and a manual safety, in addition to requiring proper grip and pressure to fire. To discharge a gun by accident, one would have to bypass all these safeguards simultaneously. Experts concluded that the gun did not simply go off. Then there was the blood spatter. Dr. Wayne Ross, a respected forensic pathologist and blood pattern analyst, examined the scene, the patterns on the walls, the direction of the blood, and the location of both Bruno and Melissa at the time of the shooting all suggested a struggle. Blood evidence indicated movement resistance, and the presence of controlling force. The blood trail was not consistent with someone accidentally firing a gun while standing safely beside a seated person. It was, instead, consistent with a confrontation. Ballistics also played a critical role. Investigators analyzed the angle and trajectory of the bullet. It did not match Bruno's original demonstration. Using a toy gun, the shot, experts concluded, could not have traveled the way Bruno claimed without deliberate positioning. These details, once overlooked, now formed a clearer picture of what happened in that bedroom. Finally, the audio from the home security system, enhanced by the FBI, added another layer. Arguments could be heard, Melissa's voice firm and fearful, Bruno's words rising with tension. Commands, interruptions, and evidence of struggle were all captured. The audio, when synchronized with blood patterns and ballistics, painted a chillingly coherent story. The night of Melissa's death was not a random misfire. It was a violent encounter that had been misrepresented for years. In my opinion, forensic analysis, when applied carefully, transforms emotion into evidence. It allows us to step back from grief and suspicion and see the mechanics of truth. In Melissa's case, the combination of ballistics, blood spatter, gun mechanics, and enhanced audio removed ambiguity. The evidence didn't scream accident. It whispered a much darker reality. Here, the science confirmed what the family had always felt in their hearts. Melissa's death was not random. It was preventable. It was deliberate. And now, finally, it could be proven. The first time investigators truly listened to the enhanced audio from Melissa Rocuba's home, it was as if the room of that August night had reopened. Every raised voice, every pause, every sound of movement carried away to what had really happened. It began subtly, a raised word here, a sharp tone there, but soon the pattern was unmistakable. Melissa's voice, firm yet fearful, could be heard arguing with Bruno. She was pleading, demanding space, asserting herself in the only way she could. And then came the tension in his responses, sharp, controlling, increasingly threatening. This was not a casual disagreement. This was a confrontation, a struggle of wills captured in the mechanical hum of security system. Then came the sounds that no one could ignore. Furniture shifting, footsteps, the sharp clatter of movement, and finally the gunshot, a single, terrifying discharge that echoed to the recording. It was immediate, irreversible, and horrifyingly final. The science and forensics had suggested the possibility of deliberate action, but now it was visceral. You could hear the moment when an ordinary evening fractured, when a family's life changed forever. Chelsea's voice followed moments later, a scream of panic, disbelief, and horror. "Mommy, Mommy." It was raw, human, unfiltered grief. In that moment, the emotional weight of the recording became undeniable. This wasn't just a crime scene report. This was a family's tragedy captured in sound. The fear, the resistance, the chaos, the irrevocable loss. Investigators noted the timeline carefully. Nearly 30 minutes had passed from the moment the couple arrived home to the instant of a gunshot. Melissa's attempt to reason, to escape, to survive, were etched into every second. The argument, the escalation, the struggle, all meticulously recorded. And for the first time, the official narrative of accidental discharge collapsed under the clarity of evidence. My opinion, audio evidence has a rare power. It doesn't just describe an event. It places you in a room, in a moment, with the people involved. For Melissa Rocuba, it gave her back her voice, her fear or courage in her final moments. And for viewers, it leaves a chilling understanding. This was not an accident. The security recording, paired with forensic analysis, was a turning point. It validated the daughter's instincts, the family's suspicions, and the mounting evidence. The night Melissa died was no longer shrouded in mystery. We could hear the truth, undeniable, haunting, and tragic. And that truth, justice finally began its slow, painful path forward. It took nearly 9 years for the wheels of justice to finally move in Melissa Rocuba's case. On the morning of June 3rd, 2022, Pennsylvania State Police officers quietly followed Bruno Rocuba as he drove to work. Every detail was planned. This was not a casual traffic stop. It was a calculated, cautious approach to apprehend a man who had evaded accountability for almost a decade. When the officers pulled him over, Bruno's reaction was calm but controlled. He answered questions, confirmed he had no weapons on him, and complied with their instructions. Within minutes, he was handcuffed. The arrest was the first tangible sign from Melissa's family that the system could still deliver consequences. Even after so many years, the charges were serious. Third-degree murder for the death of Melissa, along with allegations of theft concerning her estate, evidence from a forensic analysis, the enhanced audio recording and witness testimonies had all finally converged into a case that could not be ignored. For the daughters, seeing their father escorted by law enforcement was surreal. A mix of relief, anger, and sorrow. Justice, long delayed, was finally catching up. Over the next 2 years, legal proceedings unfolded. Bruno Rocuba, still maintaining his accident narrative, eventually agreed to a plea deal. Third-degree murder was the agreed charge, and the theft allegation was dropped. Prosecutors emphasized that while he may not have intentionally planned his wife's death, his reckless actions, arguing, drinking, handling a loaded gun during a struggle, directly led to her death. On January 8, 2025, sentencing brought both closure and sorrow. Bruno Rocuba received 12 to 40 years in prison. With the possibility of parole in 2035, Chelsea and her sister Joanne attended, carrying the weight of grief and years of unresolved questions. Joanne delivered her victim impact statement, looking her father in the eye, words carefully chosen, heavy with truth. "You tried to erase her existence," she said, "but you cannot erase her memory. You cannot erase Melissa Rocuba." For the family, this legal resolution was bittersweet. Justice had been served in the eyes of the law, yet the emotional scars remained. The daughters still struggled with the man who had been both their father and their tormentor. They had lost their mother, and years later, the wound of betrayal lingered. My opinion, legal outcomes cannot undo trauma, and plea deals are never perfect justice. But in Melissa Rocuba's case, the conviction represented acknowledgement. The system could correct its mistakes, even if delayed. It was a hard, quiet victory, a recognition of truth, responsibility, and the need to honor a life that had been stolen far too soon. Justice was no longer a distant hope. It was real, measured, and undeniable. But the pain and loss, like shadows, would follow our family for the rest of their lives. Courtrooms are usually quiet, sterile places, filled with the hum of procedure. But when Joanne Rocuba stepped the podium, the room shifted. Her presence was more than formal. It was a confrontation, a declaration, a moral reckoning. She looked directly at her father, Bruno Rocuba, and for a moment, it felt as though the years of pain, confusion, and loss were all concentrated in that one gaze. "This is not about revenge," she began, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "This is about truth. This is about my sister, Melissa. You tried to erase her from our lives, from our memories, but you cannot erase her. You cannot erase the love she gave, the life she lived, and the family she raised." Her words hung in the courtroom like a weight. She spoke of her sister's kindness, her warmth, the laughter that had once filled their home. She reminded everyone that Melissa had been more than a victim of a tragic shooting. She was a mother, a sister, a friend, someone whose life mattered in every small, human way. Joanne detailed the psychological toll of the crime, how the family had been forced to navigate a world where justice seemed distant, where their pain was invisible to the very institutions meant to protect them. She spoke of the fear, the betrayal, and the long nights of unanswered questions, and she spoke of the eerie normalcy her father tried to impose afterward, erasing texts, burning a mattress, donating her clothes, giving away her dog, as if erasing a person's existence could undo the truth of their life. Chelsea, too, delivered her statement, her voice cracking with grief and love intertwined. "I loved him, still do, but I cannot forgive what he did. I cannot forget what we lost. Every memory of my mother is now a mix of love and pain, and yet we speak her name, we remember her, and that is something he can never take away." For the audience, for viewers at home, these statements serve a deeper purpose. They are not simply words of sorrow. They are a mirror of justice in its most human form. The impact is moral, ethical, and profound. It reminds us that crimes are not just statistics. They are ruptures in human lives, with consequences that echo across families and communities. My opinion, victim impact statements are often more powerful than any forensic report or courtroom argument. They carry the weight of lived experience, the undeniable proof of love and loss, and a moral truth that some acts cannot be undone. Joanne and Chelsea's words ensured that Melissa Rocuba's life, her presence, and her humanity were recognized, and that her memory, despite all attempt to erase it, remained indelible. In that courtroom, justice was measured not just in years or legal terms, but in the truth spoken by those who had loved and lost. It was a reminder. Even in darkness, memory can be a form of resistance. Even after the courtroom doors closed and the sentence was handed down, the Rocuba family's journey did not end. Justice, as defined by law, had been served. But the emotional aftermath remained raw, complicated, and unrelenting. For Chelsea and Sabrina, the mix of relief, grief, and lingering anger created tension they could not easily untangle. "I hate him for what he did," Chelsea admits quietly, "but I loved him, and part of me always will. It's confusing. It's unfair that someone who caused so much pain could still occupy a place in your heart." The ripple effects extended beyond the daughters. Melissa's grandchildren, once innocent and carefree, were now growing up with the shadow of tragedy, the loss of a mother, the fractured relationships, and the presence of grandfather behind bars left scars that no apology could heal. Chelsea watches her son's memories of his grandmother fade into stories she now has to tell, stories that are both precious and painful, and the fear hasn't disappeared. Each year that Bruno Rocuba becomes eligible for parole brings a fresh wave of anxiety. "Every 10 years, I'll be there," Chelsea says, her voice heavy with resolve. "I have to protect my family. I have to protect my son's memory of her. Just because he's behind bars doesn't mean the danger is gone from our hearts." The family's grief is compounded by the absence of closure in simple, everyday ways. Holidays are quieter. Bedrooms remain untouched reminders of lives disrupted. Even the smallest moments, watch your favorite TV show, walking past a child at home, or hearing a familiar laugh, can trigger memories of what was lost. The emotional toll is persistent, intimate, and ongoing. My opinion, true crime rarely ends neatly. Convictions and sentences can never fully repair the fractured lives left in the wake of violence. In cases like Melissa Rocuba's, the story doesn't stop at the gavel. It continues in kitchens, backyards, and hearts. The justice system can deliver accountability, but cannot fill the void left by loss. For the Rocubas, the pain is a quiet companion. It informs decisions, shapes relationships, and lingers in the memory of a woman whose life was stolen far too soon.
And yet, through grief, they carry a commitment to honor Melissa's life, to safeguard the family she loved, and to confront the ongoing consequences of her absence with honesty, courage, and care. This is the true aftermath of tragedy, messy, complicated, and deeply human. Just when the Rocuba family thought the worst had passed, life delivered another blow, one that no one could have anticipated. Chelsea's son, Greg, Melissa's beloved grandson, was only 13 when a tragic accident claimed his life. Riding his all-terrain vehicle, he collided with an SUV. In an instant, the fragile thread of hope, healing, and continuity that the family had been clinging to snapped. "I couldn't believe it," Chelsea whispers, her voice breaking even now. "It felt like the world had collapsed all over again. First, my mother was taken from me. Then, nearly a decade later, my son gone. How is that even possible?" The loss was more than grief. It was a generational rupture. Melissa's absence had already left a gap in the family, a wound that time could not fully close. Now, with Greg gone, the ache reverberated through the lineage she had tried to protect. The family was forced to confront the cruel, unpredictable nature of life, where loss can come in waves, unannounced and unforgiving. For Chelsea and Sabrina, the death of Greg was a stark reminder that pain does not follow a linear path. Trauma can leap across generations, shaping how memories are held, how love is expressed, and how trust is rebuilt. The joy they fought to maintain in their son's early years was now replaced by sorrow and questions that had no answers. Yet, in the midst of despair, there is a quiet, stubborn resilience. Chelsea clings to the memories of her mother, her son, and the lessons they imparted. She shares stories of Melissa with her own child, ensuring that her mother's love, laughter, and kindness continue to echo in the family's life. It is in these small acts, telling a story, showing a photo, keeping tradition alive, that the Rocubas fight back against the weight of loss. My opinion? This final tragedy underscores the cruel complexity of life after violence. Even when justice is served, the emotional cost persists. Families are left to navigate the aftermath, where grief intertwines with memory, love, and the haunting presence of absence. It is a reminder that true crime is never just about the case. It is about the human lives forever changed by it. As the camera slowly pulls back, we see a family holding on to fragments of love amid tragedy. Melissa Rocuba's legacy is one of warmth, courage, and enduring memory, but it is also a testament to fragility of life and the indelible scars that remain when violence enters a home. In the silence that follows, the audience is left with profound awareness. Some stories do not end. They echo hauntingly through generations.